Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and we're on a YA novel this week because I felt like it. And also, another book didn't come in from the library because that's a thing that happens with me. So, Jessica Day George is a YA author who was publishing books well after I should have been reading YA books, but I read it anyways because I just like fantasy. So this and another of her books, which I will be hitting up next week, is a retelling of a Norwegian fairy tale. And I believe the fairy tale is normally called East of the Sun and West of the Moon, but it is also it also bears a very, very powerful resemblance in some ways to the Psyche and Eros myth. For those of you who don't know, that myth, the Greek myth of Psyche and Eros, is basically roughly that for complicated reasons, as usual involving the gods being jealous, shallow people, the goddess Aphrodite's son Eros, that is Cupid, the guy who shoots arrows at people so that they'll fall in love and stuff, it makes him fall in love, that he winds up falling in love in the due course of events with this young woman, Psyche, and he marries her, but again, due to the machinations of the gods, and in particular Aphrodite, he is forced to tell her, you can't look at my face, you cannot look at me, and, we'll be married, but you can't actually see me, and if you try to look at me, then bad things will happen. And so Psyche goes and she marries him, and they are having a relatively blissful wedded life, but she's desperately curious, and one of her sisters finally says, okay, how do you know he's not like some kind of evil cyclops or something who's gonna like eat you at some point? You have to look. And so she does, and she sees who it is, and it's not a cyclops, it's the god of sex, really. And then everything falls to pieces, and she spends the next while questing in order to get him back, and eventually they do get back together, yada yada yada. And this story very much follows that sort of formula. This starts off with, however, with a young girl whose mother, their land has been cursed for a long time. It turns out in the end it's the Queen of the Trolls, spoiler alert, that, has basically been cursing the Scandinavian region, shall we say, with winter that just won't stop, which is one of those very genuine fears in those northern countries, because when you live far enough north, winter already comes way later than everywhere else, already ends way later than everywhere else, and starts earlier than everywhere else. So the idea that it won't ever end is something that's always going to sort of be a back-of-the-mind fear. Anyway, so things are bad, and their family is poor, and the mother has a bunch of children, and when she finally has her youngest daughter, she's so disappointed it's not another boy that she refuses to even give her child a name. And so they basically just call her Girl, which upsets her father because, he wants, that he wants his daughter to have a name, not least of which because children who don't have names, who are not baptized, who have not been sort of declared as part of society, can basically be kidnapped by trolls more easily. But his wife refuses, and as it is the mother's prerogative to choose the names for children, she's stuck without a name. The eldest brother leaves and then comes back, and when he comes back, he is depressed and tired, and even though he's still a very young man, he's going gray and won't tell anybody about what happened to make him vanish for all that time and then come back as he did. And in the due course of events, she meets up with a white stag, which, as per tradition, a white reindeer, really, and as per tradition, a white deer grants her effectively one wish and a gift, and the wish is, when it turns out that she cannot wish to get her eldest brother's, depression lifted to make him happy again, because he has apparently been cursed by trolls, she is able to wish for a name for herself, which she is duly granted by the deer, and the deer also grants her the ability to talk to animals. This is mostly just a thing that allows them to get by in a way they couldn't have before, because whenever something's wrong with a local animal, she can always, talk to the animal and find out exactly what's wrong. But this gets the attention of a giant white talking bear. That is, a polar bear shows up at their front door and demands that she come with it. And she gets carted off by the bear to this palace in the middle of nowhere, which is where the similarity to the Cupid and Psyche myth comes in, because she is not to ask questions, she is not to look into things, she, people can't explain things to her, and, she endlessly asks questions because she doesn't understand. She doesn't understand because there are foreign supernatural creatures being held captive in this effectively Norwegian ice palace. There's a gargoyle from France and salamanders from someplace with a lot of sand in the south, and a faun who is Greek, and a Selkie who is, I think, German. The point is, they're from all over, and she doesn't understand why, and it's puzzling and it's weird, and she's trying to figure it out, because one would. You want to understand what's going on and why you are where you are. But when she asks too many questions, they start disappearing, ostensibly having been killed. And, when she finds out one day that her father is ill, and she goes home for a few days, and one of her sisters says, "You don't know what's going on. There's a strange man in your bed every night. This needs to be resolved. You need to look. You need to find out what's happening, because, what could be happening?" And so she looks, because, her sister has talked her around to being really concerned for her safety, understandably so, and everything explodes, and she, instead of going home, goes questing to find where she needs to be. And along the way, she is told that she needs to get to a palace that is, west of the sun and east of the moon, or east of the sun, west of the moon, whatever, same diff, practically, which is basically determined to be someplace at the very North Pole, because once you are that far north, once you are at the pole, once you are all the way up, you are east of everywhere and west of everywhere simultaneously. And she makes it there, and she does various, fairy tale things to get in, and saves the day, and goes home with her prince, who it turns out is the prince of the land she is from, and brings home her brother's, fiance, girlfriend, person, who had also been trapped in the castle, because he'd been trapped in the castle and had barely managed to escape with his life. And so, we have this, but the entire time, it's a fairy tale. It follows the traditional fairy tale tropes of, you talking to things that you cannot speak, that you can't normally speak with, like the wind, and having, people, these trolls, be fascinated by ordinary things like carding combs for wool or spinning wool into thread, because trolls cannot create things, they can only imitate. And using a trollish marriage tradition of requesting one thing that the future wife needs to be able to do, or else the marriage is off, and taking advantage of that tradition to force the trolls to let them go. This is all traditional fairy tale stuff, but it's a fairy tale that if you are a person coming out of the English and French tradition, you're less likely to have heard it. Not entirely unlikely. The phrase "east of the sun, west of the moon" has come across my path before. It's not an entirely unknown one. I assume that makes this one of those really, really well-known stories. But you're less likely to run across it. Anyways, it's a good retelling. It's an enjoyable retelling. It's just real enough to sort of ground it, but also just fairy tale enough that you're still reading a fairy tale. This isn't one of those adaptations where it's almost not a fairy tale. You can just sort of barely see the bare bones of it underneath. This is the fairy tale. It's just expanded. And I get a particular joy out of those, because the thing about a fairy tale is, when you're reading a fairy tale, often what you want that and a happily ever after story. You want that story where people do strange and fantastical things that have no real connection to reality because there is an internal fairy tale logic to them. It's always very important to keep in mind that fairy tales have an internal logic, and it's an internal logic that meets up with local folklore, with how you have decided the fairy tale world functions, that is different from how the real world works. And while there is a place for real world retellings of fairy tales, there's also a place for fairy tales where we accept the internal logic of them, because that is how the world of the fairy tale functions. That, when Rumpelstiltskin's name is found out, that he is bound by the nature of what he is to give up the child. That it's not just, some sort of, that there is a way in which magics of the fairy tale function to force that upon him. And so this is one that I really, really enjoy because it places itself firmly in where it's supposed to be from, that is Norwegian, in Norway specifically, but Scandinavia more generally. It places itself firmly there, but it also places itself firmly in fairy tale logic. And so you have to approach it from that perspective, while at the same time sort of expanding things and expanding characters and giving us more than the bare bones description of characters that you normally get in a fairy tale, because a fairy tale is short. It's supposed to be the kind of thing that you tell a kid right before bedtime, that you tell around a fireplace, around a campfire, that it's something that cannot be overly detailed because it's supposed to be something that lives in your memory, and if you have too many details, you may not remember the whole story. And so this hits that point of being a novel where there's too much detail for, telling a story right before bedtime, but at the same time remains really true to the essence of how fairy tales are. And so I really, really enjoyed this, but I've liked Jessica Day George's fairy tale retellings, which, as I said, that's another one that I will be getting to when I see you next week.